Okay, so your textbook does, talk about the Economist Democracy Index in its like sort of global comparison graph that's in the textbook. But your textbook also talks about other components in the United States that are key to creating popular sovereignty and key to making a democracy that is healthy and capable of thriving. And so we're going to take time now to look at those additional components that your textbook talks about. Now, I want to remind you about the definition or one way of thinking about democracy. Democracy, rule of the people, that what that really means is popular sovereignty, okay? Popular meaning the populace, the people. And so, sovereignty means that you have the ultimate authority. And in this case, the ultimate authority to govern, to rule. And popular sovereignty is saying that it's the people that have that ultimate authority, that the authority to rule rests with the people. And so, we talked about this in the last slide, in the last lecture. But political authority, this is popular sovereignty defined, means that the political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. And so we put a lot of trust in our people in a democracy. And you can kind of see why it's maybe not the most popular form of government, right? Because it's easy to see people as flawed, and that it's hard to trust people to, have that kind of authority. And so your textbook talks about that when you have a democracy where the authority ultimately rests with the people, that you really need to have a citizenry that is both knowledgeable and active. In other words, we need to have political knowledge that is predicating, that's based upon our political action, okay? Now, later in the semester, we'll talk more about political participation, okay? Actually, voting has really sort of increased in the last 5 years, so we're actually a pretty active citizenry. But are we a knowledgeable citizenry? So we'll take a look at political knowledge. Another key feature is that the people have to feel as if their voice and actions make a difference, right? We live in a representative democracy, remember, we live in a republic. That means that we elect people to make decisions for us, right? But if that authority is ultimately going to rest with us, we have to feel like when we vote that our vote makes a difference, right? That we vote for a person because they're going to implement a certain policy. They say that on the campaign trail, but then they don't do it. We may not have trust. We might not feel like our vote was actually heard. If we feel disconnected, that your voice doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you protest, things never change. It doesn't matter if you vote, things never change. If there's a disconnect between the people and the people who are representing them, then that's problematic. And so when you have a country that has a strong sense of political efficacy and trust in government, right, then it's probably and more likely to be more of a vibrant democracy, because there's a closer connection between those who are doing the governing and those who are selecting those to govern. But if you feel like your voice doesn't matter and your actions don't make a difference and there's a big disconnect, that means that country has a low level of political efficacy and trust. And it won't surprise you that the United States has very low levels of political efficacy and trust. And that, as we mentioned, on the previous slides, that the government it needs to be responsive to the will of the people. Okay, we elect people and we expect them to do what we elect them to do. And if the decisions that they're making are not reflective of what the people want, that can be problematic in a democracy. So let's look at each of these features individually. And so your textbook defines political knowledge as when people possess information about the formal institutions of government, political actors, and political issues, okay? And so that since people are going to be actively involved, we want to make sure that they know about the major issues and actors that are involved in politics, right? And so if we're testing and trying to measure a person's political knowledge, we might ask them, what are some of the institutions of government, right? We might ask them, what are the three branches of government? We might ask them, like, what does the U.S. House of Representatives do? If we're asking about political actors, we might say, hey, who is the Vice President of the United States? And if we're asking about political issues, we might ask people to explain the state of the economy. We might ask them questions about like inflation, what is the inflationary level in the United States, and those sorts of things. It gives you a sense of whether or not they're paying attention and are knowledgeable about the issues that are facing us. Now, keep in mind that political knowledge is more than an opinion or strongly held viewpoint, okay? You can believe that the world is flat, but the world is not flat. All scientific evidence indicates that the world is a sphere. The Earth is a sphere. It is not flat. So you can have that opinion, but it's not a fact, right? And so political knowledge, I mean, if I asked you who were name one of the Supreme Court justices, and you said Thurgood Marshall, right? I would say, or if I asked you who's currently sitting on the Supreme Court, and you said Thurgood Marshall, I would say, well, that may be your opinion, but that is not a fact. So it's important, political knowledge is important because democracy depends on enlightened political engagement. If you're voting for somebody and you don't know where they stand on particular political issues, if you're electing somebody for a particular a role in government and you don't understand what that governmental institution does, that if you can't differentiate between different candidates as you go to the ballot box, that can definitely be problematic. So let's take a look at just how politically knowledgeable Americans are. So, hey, before we take a look at how politically knowledgeable Americans are, why don't we see how politically knowledgeable you are and test yourself? And I know that's why you're taking the class. When I used to teach this class face to face, I'd hand out like a, questionnaire about their knowledge, and people were like, that's why I'm taking the class. But it's still sort of fun to test yourself. Okay, so these are traditional questions that are on a political knowledge test. Can you name the three branches of government? What is the Bill of Rights? There are 5 liberties listed in the First Amendment. What are they? How many justices are on the Supreme Court? And bonus, can you name one of the Supreme Court justices? All right, you can click this off if you want, write down your answers, and then we will come back together. So how did you do? What are the 3 branches of government? The legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. What is the Bill of Rights? The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments of the United States Constitution. There are 27 amendments altogether. There are 5 liberties listed in the First Amendment. What are they? Speech, religion, press, assembly, petition for redress of grievances. How many judges are on the Supreme Court? 9, although it's not set in the Constitution, as you're going to find out this semester. And can you name one of the Supreme Court justices? Well, we've got Chief Justice John Barrett, Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, the new addition to the court. So how did you do? Well, let's see how you would do in comparison to the rest of America. So every year, the Annenberg School of Public Policy at the University of Pennsylvania, they do a Constitution Day civics survey, and Constitution Day is actually coming up in less than 2 weeks. And so every year they kind of measure political knowledge in the United States. And political knowledge has actually been on the rise since 2016. But this 2022 survey, it shows the first decline in political knowledge since 2016, which was kind of interesting. So, if you weren't able to answer the question about the three branches of government, you're not alone. Less than half of US adults, 47%, could name all three branches of government. And that was down from 56%. When I taught this lecture last semester, I was like, oh, yeah, knowledge keeps going up. But we've had a little bit of a backslide. And it's the first decline in this question since 2016. 26%, when asked how many liberties are in the First Amendment, 26% didn't know any of the liberties, okay? And the most known is freedom of speech, and that's actually gone down. 63% of people could identify freedom of speech, but in 2021 it was 74%. The next was religion. 24% of people could say that religion was in the Bill of Rights. But freedom of press was at 20%. Freedom of assembly was at 16%, and to petition the right of government for redress of grievances, that was at 6%. So if you got all five, good job, you. So how many people can name one member of the Supreme Court? Well, 52% of people cannot name one member of the Supreme Court, okay? That number's gone down a little bit. It used to be that when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, was sort of popular, people could name her. But more than half of Americans couldn't tell you one justice on the Supreme Court. So it doesn't probably come as a surprise to most of you that people in the United States don't know a lot about American government. I think the question is it something that we should be concerned about, right? I mean, clearly we should be concerned, to a certain degree, that if something as basic as the three branches of government, if people don't know what that is, and can't identify the three branches, that's a little concerning, right? Because the whole sort of foundation, the structure of our government, not just at the federal level, but at the state levels and really the city and county levels as well, is based on that separation of powers, that you have one branch that makes decisions, another branch that executes those decisions, and another that solves the disputes that arise around those. And not knowing that we have those three branches, to me, that's a bit of a cause for concern. Is it a cause for concern that you can't name any of the liberties in the Bill of Rights? Or in the First Amendment? That's a little concerning, right? You would think people would at least know speech. But I guess what's more important to me is, do people actually know what these liberties mean, right? Can you tell me when we say that we have the freedom of speech, what does that mean? Well, if you tell me that that means that you can say whatever you want, wherever you want, whenever you want, well, that's not what freedom of speech is in the United States, right? If you tell me that, as they did in the Annenberg Civics Survey, that the First Amendment applies to Facebook, a private corporation, which it doesn't, the First Amendment freedom of speech applies to the government. All of the Bill of Rights applies to the actions of the government. That's concerning, okay? And so, I think there is some cause for concern here, but I think that we need to dig in a little bit more deeply to just see what's the degree of not knowing these, different features of American democracy. We saw an increase in political knowledge from 2017 to 2021, and then we see this decline in 2022. When I taught this last semester, I was like, do we think this increased knowledge is going to be a trend that continues into the future? And the answer to that is, well, at least not into 2022. We'll see what the 2023 survey says. But maybe it's just because the election of Donald Trump was just such a hot topic. Everybody was invested in it, whether you were for Trump or for Clinton. It was the pandemic was going on. And so people, I think, were paying attention to the news in ways that maybe they weren't. And things have calmed down since then. So maybe people are a little bit more checked out and paying attention to other aspects of their lives, which is normal. But just some things to get you thinking. Another feature of a healthy democracy is the presence of a high level of political efficacy. Political efficacy is a belief that you can influence what government does. It's the feeling that you make a difference, that if you write a letter to your member of Congress, they're going to read that letter, they're going to take it into consideration. And in fact, if enough people sort of petition their members of Congress for, change, that change is actually going to happen. that you feel that if you attend a rally or a protest, that you're going to raise awareness about an issue, and that because you raise awareness, that you can actually make change. And it also just simply means that your vote matters, and that if your vote is in the majority of those who voted, that the policies you voted for are going to be sort of put into action, right? And so when you have a strong, high sense of political efficacy, it means that you really feel like you can make a difference. But in the United States, we don't have a high level of political efficacy. Our sense of political efficacy is low. A lot of people feel like their voice doesn't matter, that they can't make a difference, and that they're kind of helpless in the face of situations, problems that are facing the United States, and a lot of people feel like there's just nothing that they can do about it. So let's look at some evidence to support that claim that there's low political efficacy in the United States. So this is a little bit of an older survey, but we're going to look at some newer information in a second. But, given what we know today about political efficacy, I don't think things have changed much. So this was from the Pew Research Center in 2015. They asked the question about, elected officials, that how do you feel about your elected officials? Most say that they lose touch quickly with the people. Like, not most, 77%, 74% don't care what people like me think. 74% say they put their own interests first, right? And that is a really good example of low political efficacy. And this from the same Pew research in 2015, asking people, do elected officials care about people like me or don't care about people like me? 74% of people say that most elected officials don't care what people like me think. So again, this big sense of detachment from those who are governing over us. You see the same sentiment here in this more recent poll from 2023 that was conducted by the Associated Press, but in tandem with the nonpartisan polling company polling group at the University of Chicago. It's asking the question: do people feel like their interests are represented well by the United States government? And most Americans say, 45% say not very well, not at all well, somewhat well. The other 41%, only 13% feel like that government's representing the interests of the people. And when you ask people like you, that 53% of people say government's not really interested in representing. They don't feel like the interests of people like you are being represented. And in this graph from NORC, you sort of see continued low efficacy. That, as it says there, that most Americans believe that democratic institutions are failing in the United States. And that's particularly the case if you're a Republican in the United States, at least for some of the branches of government. When it comes to the top line there, let me put my magic pen on here. Here overall, 46% of people say that President Biden's, doing either a really bad job or a somewhat bad job. 45% think that the Supreme Court is not doing a good job. Strong pluralities dislike the Republican Party, and same with Congress, right? And we do. I want you to, on your own time, you can take a look at sort of these gaps here, right? I mean, that the Republicans think that the Democratic Party is not doing a very good job, and likewise, that the Democrats don't think that the Republican Party is doing a very good job, and across the board we have a lot of lack of trust in our Congress. And sorry to bombard you with graphs here, but they are very interesting. So this is again from the Pew Research Center, and this basically, we've chronicled trust over time, and so I think that this is good. Kind of puts it in perspective, right? Political efficacy is one thing. That's where you're saying that you don't feel like your voice is being heard. But trust in government is another measure. They talk about that in your textbook as well. And so, historically, we've asked the question that do you trust government to do what is right? some of the time, all of the time, most of the time, or none of the time, right? And this basically shows the percentage of people that said that, and again, let me put on my magic pen, that basically are saying that, yes, that they trust government to do what is right about all the time or most of the time, okay? And so in the 1960s, it was 70%. And then it's like, whoops, Nixon comes, just crashes at that point, kind of get reality comes in, and then it really hovers and, it gets a little bit higher during the Reagan, goes down during Clinton, right? We get 9/11 here, so trust in government is going to go up somewhat, but it barely breaks the 50% point. And from that point forward, George W. Bush goes down, and it basically stays down from that point forward, right? And so, we just see this decline, right, and some going up and down. But at least for the last almost 20 years, it's just really been in the basement in terms of people trusting government. Okay, so I want you to think critically about political efficacy and trust, and here are just some questions to get you thinking. So for you, which do you think is more concerning? Or maybe they're equally concerning, right? Do you think a lack of political knowledge is more concerning? Or do you think it's more concerning that we have low levels of trust and efficacy? In other words, if you had to choose in a democratic society, a society that had higher levels of trust and felt like their voice was heard, but they didn't have a lot of political knowledge, would that be preferred? Or would you, basically say that you'd like to have people to have a high political knowledge, even if that's coupled with a low level of trust and a low level of efficacy? So maybe think about which of those the trust and efficacy versus knowledge, which one gives you more cause for concern, particularly when it's low. Ask yourself, what impact does low political efficacy and lack of trust in government have on maintaining a democratic society, right? If you don't trust government and you also have sort of a negative attitude about your fellow citizens. We had some of that in the commentary from the first week. If distrust among parties is so high, can you really have a democratic society? A democratic society is where we let all players sort of equally participate, compete for, influencing government, and then, the side that loses is gracious and accepts that the other side won. When you really have this sense of low trust and political efficacy, does it become more difficult to maintain a democratic society? I think the answer is yes, but maybe think about that a little bit more. So the last feature we're going to talk about here is the importance of a democracy being responsive to what the people want, being responsive, listening to the so-called will of the people, okay? First in a democracy, and we talked about this in the first part of the lecture, is you have to have a way of determining what the people want, right? That you have to have free and fair elections, right? So that when people go in to vote, that they feel like they can vote, that they feel like their vote is counted, and that there isn't fraud or, some sort of outside pressures to change the outcomes of elections. We also have to accept the outcome of elections. When the election is over, we accept, if there seems to be some malfeasance or errors, sure, have a recount. We've always done that. That's nothing new. But after we go through all the procedures to determine that, yes, indeed, this was a fair election, that we accept the outcomes of that. We also determine the will of the people because we let people, speak, right? We get, we have freedom of speech, press, association. You can join groups. And so a democracy not only has to be responsive to the will of the people, but obviously there needs to be mechanisms in place so the will of the people is known, okay? And that we also have, that the will of the people is not just some people, but it's all people, okay? And that's what we talked about earlier in the lecture about pluralism, okay? Democracy is about pluralism. That means that all voices, all perspectives, all interests have the right to compete for the influence of government, right? All interest groups can try to persuade government and governmental officials to implement this policy or to not implement this policy. However, we have to let everybody participate. However, we have to, when the competition is over, that we've got to step back and we have to see that the other side legitimately won, and that the outcome of that competition has to be compromise and moderation. Just because you didn't win doesn't mean that you can do whatever it takes to block the will of the side that won, because that is the side that was in the majority. And so finally, majority rules with limits. So we have to know what the will of the people is. And the will of the people, at least defined, is with the person who gets the most votes, they win the seat, right? Majority rules. That you can talk in your textbook, they talk about the importance of majority rule with limits, that we have to make sure, and this is coupled in with pluralism, that we have to make sure that when the majority does rule, that they don't trample on the rights of those who are not in the majority, right? And so part of majority rules is that you won, but you win with an eye towards compromise and moderation, because a democracy isn't just 50% plus one, but democracies make decisions for everybody in that country. And that means everybody. And so when you win the election, you must keep an eye on those who are not in the majority and respect their rights. So democracies need to have mechanisms in place to figure out what the will of the people is. But democracies also have to have the will of the people be reflected in the decisions that government makes. Government needs to be responsive to the will of the people. Well, at least in the United States, people don't feel as if government is being responsive to their needs. This is again from the polling from the University of Chicago, and this is asking the question about how well do you think public opinion is being reflected in the laws and policies that are passed in the United States. And just take a look at this, this is the not too well or not well at all, right? All of that is in the majority. And so people feel like their healthcare concerns, their concerns about gender identity, abortion policy, immigration, the list goes on, that the kinds of policies we have, people do not think that it's reflecting what public opinion on those key issues are. That's a cause for concern. So in the previous slide, it showed that most Americans don't feel like that the public opinion of Americans is being reflected in public policy. What is the public opinion on some of the key issues? Well, won't come as a surprise to you, but 68% of Americans, according to a Gallup poll in November of 2020, support the legalization of marijuana. And even though marijuana is legalized in some states, not all, it's certainly not legal at the federal level. That according to a Gallup 2022 poll, 85% of people think that abortion should be legal in certain or all circumstances, okay? So 50% of people think it should be legal in certain circumstances, 35% in all, for a total of 85%. 61% of people support getting rid of the Electoral College. Last I checked, we still had it. 63% of Americans want to ban assault-style weapons from a Pew Research in 2021. Again, the Congress has had very limited success or a limited movement on gun reform, even though public opinion strongly supports it. And 73 support a federal investment in paid family leave. And as you remember, for the Democratic Party, paid family leave was a part of their Build Back Better bill that never got through Congress, okay? So when you sort of look at what the public opinion is and the actions that government take, it's no surprise that many don't feel like public opinion is being, that government is responsive to the will of the people, what the people want. So let's take a moment to just quickly think critically about why public policy doesn't reflect public opinion. In other words, why does it seem like government is not responsive to the will of the people? Well, we clearly cannot answer this question here at the end of a long lecture, but there's just some things I want you to keep in mind throughout the semester as we're moving forward and learning more about these things, like kind of bringing it back. If I mention it now, maybe it'll bring it back. I think part of it could just be the way that we elect people, right? Later in the semester, we're going to learn about the primary system, that when, parties elect their candidates for who they want to be the candidate to represent their party, right? And sometimes the most extreme people show up for primaries. And so they might elect a candidate or nominate a candidate to run in the general election that really is reflective of what a very small percentage of people want, not what the majority of the people want. So keep that in mind as we get to that later in the semester. It could also be the way we our voting method. We use a winner take all, and so we use a plurality system. Whoever gets the most votes win. And so that can also be like the majority of people might not want the person who's actually elected because that person didn't actually get the majority of the votes. And so we're going to look at other methods for voting, including ranked choice voting, that might make it so that government is more reflective and responsive to the will of the people. It could be money and interest groups, right? I mean, people vote, but there are other mechanisms and other influencers that are actually shaping the decisions that members of Congress make once they are elected. It could be that people have opinions, but they just don't show up to vote, right? And that could be, dovetail into what we talked about low political efficacy. If you don't feel like your vote matters, why would you show up to vote? We do have good voting turnout in the United States. It's improved, but it's still like in the 60s. That means that, 35% for general national elections aren't voting. And that's even bigger, numbers of people don't vote in state and local elections. Ask what your opinion on abortion is or on legalizing marijuana. You've got an opinion, but it doesn't matter if you don't get out there to vote. All right. So in conclusion, that labeling, we've learned today that labeling your country a democracy is easy, but creating and maintaining a democracy, being truly a democratic country, is much more difficult. It obviously takes participation, work, dedication to the democratic experiment. But it even takes more than that. It takes holding governments accountable to making sure that those features of democracy that we talked about, free and fair elections, transparency, lack of corruption, abiding by the rule of law, all of those things need to be pressured. We need a pressure to make sure that our government is following through on those. Thanks a lot for listening to this lecture. Next week, we're going to start looking at, the beginnings of this democracy. And so we're going to be looking at the founding and we're going to look at the documents and the values that are really at the foundation of this democratic experiment. Thanks for listening. Appreciate your time and attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.